In 2019, US police killed approximately 1,000 civilians. That same year, German police killed 11. Finnish police fired their weapons a total of roughly 10 times, the entire year. These aren't cherry-picked anomalies. They're part of a consistent, documented pattern that researchers, criminologists, and police experts have been studying for decades. So what's actually going on? Why does policing look so different on opposite sides of the Atlantic? And more importantly, what does the data tell us about why? This is not a political argument. This is an evidence-based look at two fundamentally different systems and how they got that way. Let's start with the raw data, because it's striking. According to a study published in the Annual Review of Criminology, the United States rate of fatal police shootings in 2019 was 3.1 per million residents. France's rate was 0.14. That means US police killed civilians at a rate more than 22 times higher than French police. Compared to Australia, the US rate was nearly 5 times higher. Norway has recorded just 4 people killed by police since 2002. Iceland, where gun ownership is actually quite common, has only 1 documented case of a civilian killed by police in the country's entire history. Now, some people will immediately say the US has more guns, more violent crime. It's not a fair comparison, and that's a legitimate point, one will address, but it doesn't fully explain the gap. Because researchers have controlled for gun ownership and crime rates, and the disparity in police lethality still stands out as exceptional. Within the US, the disparities compound further. Black Americans face fatal police violence at nearly 3 times the rate of white Americans, according to data from Mapping Police Violence, despite being less likely, statistically, to be armed at the time of an encounter. So what's driving this? It comes down to 5 structural factors. And they all work together. The first and perhaps most fundamental difference is training. Not just how long it is, but what it actually teaches. In the United States, there is no national standard for police training. The country has over 18,000 separate local law enforcement agencies, and each one sets its own requirements. On average, US officers receive roughly 21 weeks of basic training before being put on the street, though in some states, that figure drops as low as 10 weeks. Compare that to Europe. In Finland, officers must complete a 3-year degree at the National Police University College, equivalent to a bachelor's degree. In Norway, the same. Germany requires 2.5 years. Even countries like Estonia and Croatia mandate around 18 months of training. But it's not just quantity of training, it's content. In American police academies, cadets receive a median of 60 hours of firearms training and 51 hours of self-defense. They receive just 8 hours on mediation and conflict resolution. In Norway, the entire first year of training is dedicated to the social role of police and their ethical obligations before recruits ever touch a weapon. In Finland, use of force training doesn't even begin until 4 months into the curriculum. By that point, a Minneapolis police recruit would already have been awarded their badge and their gun. Henri Rikander, a former chief inspector at Finland's Police University College, put it plainly. In Finland, before officers learn how to use force, they learn legislation, criminal law, human rights, and the ethical foundations of policing. Even after 3 years of training in Finland, 30% of a student's final grade is a series of psychological interviews and assessments, designed specifically to determine whether that officer can be trusted with a gun and institutional authority. In the US, many departments spend less than 5% of their budgets on recruit training, according to a 2020 survey by the Police Executive Research Forum. The Institute for Criminal Justice Training Reform, after studying over 100 countries, concluded that the United States ranked at or near the bottom globally for police training hours. Chuck Wexler, Executive Director of the Police Executive Research Forum, summarized it bluntly. American training is outdated, antiquated, and trying to do on the cheap what other places have done in a comprehensive way. There's something researchers call the danger imperative, and it goes a long way toward explaining not just how American officers are trained, but how they think. In US police academies, recruits regularly watch videos of officers who were killed in the line of duty, officers who, the message implies, hesitated. They participate in kill or be killed use of force simulations. The lesson, reinforced from the very beginning of training, is that danger is everywhere and hesitation is death. Sociologist Michael Sierra Arevalo, after observing 3 US police departments across different regions, documented how this danger imperative becomes part of an officer's core identity from day one of the academy. The result is a force trained to be perpetually on alert, where everyday objects, movements, or behaviors that would barely register in a European context can be interpreted as threats. This cultural difference is reinforced by law. In the United States, the legal standard for use of deadly force is whether an officer had a reasonable belief that their life or someone else's was in danger. This is a subjective standard. In Europe, the standard is fundamentally different. The European Convention on Human Rights, which all 47 member states are bound by, permits deadly force only when it is absolutely necessary. Killing is considered unnecessary if alternatives existed. In Spain, national police guidelines prescribe a clear escalation: verbal warnings first, then warning shots, then shots at non-vital body parts, before lethal force can be used. In Finland and Norway, officers must obtain permission from a superior officer whenever possible before shooting anyone. In the US, only 8 states require verbal warnings before an officer can open fire. Warning shots and shots at non-vital areas are typically prohibited outright. Here's something that surprises most people outside the United States. There is no national police force. No single body sets standards, no single authority enforces accountability, and no single institution controls training. The US has over 18,000 municipal, county, and state law enforcement agencies. Every single one operates largely independently, setting its own hiring standards, training requirements, use of force policies, and disciplinary procedures. This creates enormous variation. Basic academy training ranges from 280 hours in some states to over 1,000 hours in others. What's acceptable use of force in one jurisdiction may be grounds for termination in another, and there's very little mechanism to transfer accountability between agencies. In Europe, the model is almost the exact opposite. Municipal police in most European countries are either unarmed, lack arrest authority, or don't exist at all. The armed police forces that citizens routinely encounter are national or regional, bound by centralized standards, national training institutions, and overarching human rights law. This centralization makes it dramatically easier to set consistent behavioral standards, enforce disciplinary measures, and create a unified culture within a police force. In the US, a police officer fired for misconduct in one city can often walk across a county line and be hired by another department, with no national database tracking their record. Even when US police officers engage in misconduct, they enjoy a remarkable legal shield that has no real equivalent in Europe. It's called qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a doctrine created by the US Supreme Court that protects government officials, including police officers, from civil lawsuits, even in cases where they may have violated the Constitution, as long as they didn't violate clearly established law at the time. In practice, critics argue this sets an almost impossible standard. To successfully sue an officer for misconduct, courts often require that a prior court had ruled an officer violated the Constitution under nearly identical circumstances. Not just similar, nearly identical. The doctrine was first established in 1967, originally intended to protect officers acting in good faith in legally ambiguous situations. But starting around 2005, courts increasingly applied it to cases involving excessive or deadly force, creating what a 2020 Reuters analysis described as a nearly fail-safe tool to let police brutality go unpunished. The contrast with Europe is stark. In European countries, officers are personally and institutionally accountable under both national law and the European Convention on Human Rights. The duty of precaution under the ECHR means that an officer can face prosecution, not just for the moment they pulled a trigger, but for the entire chain of decisions that led to that moment. Accountability, in that framework, is built into the system from the ground up. It would be incomplete to discuss American policing without addressing the context in which it operates. The US has the highest rate of civilian gun ownership in the world, approximately 120 firearms per 100 residents. For an American police officer, any encounter with a civilian carries a statistical possibility that the civilian is armed. That is a real and meaningful difference from policing in, say, Denmark or Portugal, where civilian gun ownership is heavily regulated and far less common. Research published by Rutgers University found a very strong correlation, 0.97, between a country's gun homicide rate and its rate of fatal police violence. In other words, armed communities and armed encounters are part of the equation. But, and this is important, the gun ownership argument doesn't explain everything. Iceland has significant gun ownership and virtually no police killings. Switzerland is heavily armed and has minimal police violence. Norway, Finland, and Germany all have meaningful civilian gun ownership and multi-year police training programs, and their fatal police violence rates remain a fraction of the US figure. The guns are part of the context. They are not the whole explanation. So what does this all add up to? The United States has built a policing system that is, by international standards, undertrained, fragmented, under-accountable, and culturally oriented toward threat response over community service. That didn't happen by accident. It happened through decades of policy decisions, underfunded training, decentralized structure, legal doctrines that limit accountability, and a training philosophy that emphasizes force over de-escalation. European countries, particularly in Scandinavia, built something different. They treat policing as a profession in the fullest sense of the word, requiring years of rigorous academic and practical preparation, rooted in human rights obligations, held to centralized standards, and evaluated not just on crime statistics, but on public trust. The results are visible in the data. More than 90% of the Finnish public trust their police, according to studies cited by Finnish police training officials. In the US, that trust is fragmented along racial and economic lines and has been declining for years. None of this means European policing is perfect. Racial disparities in stops and searches exist across Europe. Police misconduct happens. There are ongoing debates about surveillance, immigration enforcement, and the treatment of minority communities throughout the continent. But when it comes to the fundamental question, how likely is a civilian to be killed by a police officer? The gap between the United States and its peer nations is not a rounding error. It is a structural outcome, and structural problems require structural solutions. The conversation about policing in America is often framed as a debate between two sides, but the data from around the world suggests it doesn't have to be a debate at all. It can be a blueprint. Countries that invested in longer training, centralized standards, robust accountability, and a culture of de-escalation did not end up with less safety. They ended up with more trust and far fewer people dying. That's not ideology, that's evidence. If you found this video useful, consider sharing it. The sources for every statistic in this video are linked in the description. See you in the next one.